organization called Carbon Washington. So thank you so much for coming to spend a few minutes with us. So we're the group called Carbon Washington that's here working here in Washington State on our revenue neutral carbon tax campaign. So, yeah. And I actually, I have a PhD in economics from the University of Washington. Duncan has a master's degree from the University of Washington. Believe it or not, I make a living doing stand-up comedy about economics.
Really?
I do. So if you, that in itself is entertaining. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So if you're interested in more about that, then you can go to my website, which is standupeconomist.com. But I will show you my T-shirt. This is my Enjoy Capitalism T-shirt.
What is this?
Which was made in China. You put the tag on the back. It's actually this one. Yeah, it's actually made out of 20% cotton and 80% irony. So I have a couple more jokes I can tell you, but mostly I'll refer you to standupeconomist.com and my website. I do have a series of You Might Be an Economist if jokes, like you might be an economist if you think that America's next top model should be a macroeconomic growth model. Or you might be an economist if you don't read human interest stories because they don't interest you. Or you might be an economist if you think that supply and demand is a good answer to questions like, where do babies come from? Or you might be an economist if you adamantly refuse to sell your children because you think they'll be worth more later. So anyway, that's what I do for a living, believe it or not. So we're almost there. Great. So that was the comedy part. Sorry, we're going to be serious for most of the rest of the time. Although I will show you the place where I lived in. I'm going to show you. This is a picture. I figured if I was going to work on climate change issues, I should know something about China. So I finagled a position at a Chinese university. I lived in Beijing for 5 months, and this is a view from my apartment window. I lived in a housing complex in Beijing that houses 400,000 people. And this is what the view looked like about 5% of the time. Much more often, the view from my apartment window looked like that. Yeah, so pretty serious pollution problems in China. Right, so these local air pollution problems are not the same thing as global climate change. Right, these are local air pollutants like particulate matter and sulfur dioxide and things like that. And climate change is mostly about what's climate change mostly about?
Greenhouse gas.
Greenhouse gases. Right, and what's the main? Welcome, come on in. You missed all the jokes though, sorry. The only remaining seats are up front.
Sit up there. Sit up there.
So I was showing everybody this view from my apartment window in Beijing, which occasionally look like this, but much more often look like that. So local air pollution is about particulates, and global climate change. How many of you have studied climate change or global warming and things like that? Okay, and then, so it's about greenhouse gases, and what's the primary greenhouse gas?
CO2.
Carbon dioxide, right? And what's the primary source of human contributions to carbon dioxide?
Fossil fuels.
So fossil fuels, right? By which we mean, what are fossil fuels?
Gasoline.
Okay, so petroleum. What else is a fossil fuel?
Coal.
Coal is a fossil fuel, and one more. So coal, oil, and natural
Gases.
natural gas. So those are the three big fossil fuels, and let me just give you a little bit of the kind of the climate science basics, and then we can start talking about the policy stuff that I work on. So we have this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up.
Look to this
Nobody
one.
really doubts this. Nobody doubts that this is primarily driven by human activity, right, burning fossil fuels. And any guesses as to the number 2 source of increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere? Think like Brazil or Indonesia. Number 2 source of CO2 concentrations? Deforestation?
Oh.
Who said that? Oh, yeah. Deforestation. Right, and you notice like really interesting
smart.
things. So for instance, so this is the actual level of CO2 in the atmosphere. And there's you can see that each year there's like a wiggle. Right, so there's this upward trend, that's the human contribution. And then each year there's a wiggle. And the wiggle is actually because there's more land area in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. And so there's more plant matter in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. So when it's spring and summer in the northern hemisphere, what are those plants doing? They're photosynthesizing, right? So they're sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, so the atmosphere concentration goes down. And when at the same time, it's winter in the southern hemisphere, and so those plants are dropping their leaves and decomposing and all that sort of stuff, which puts carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. But there's more land area in the northern hemisphere, so the northern hemisphere effect dominates. Which is kind of cool, right? So this is sometimes like the hippies say that the planet is breathing. But you see this annual cycle, and then you see this increasing trend over time. So carbon concentrations are going up. Then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. Okay, so this is the greenhouse theory. This theory actually goes back more than 100 years. It goes back to this fellow. His name was Arrhenius. He was a Swedish chemist. And in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. So roughly midway through the lives of most of you here in the room, we hope. So his estimate from 1896 was about 5 degrees Celsius, about 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Right, and that estimate from 1896 of what would happen if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere is still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. He did those calculations with paper and pencil, and now we do these things on supercomputers and stuff, right? But they're in the same ballpark. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden. And we tend to be a little more concerned about changing the basic functionings of planet Earth. All right, in any case, we've been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so, and here are the results of the experiment. So the blue dots are individual years, and the red bars are 10-year average temperatures, starting in the 1880s and going up through the 1970s, right, which is when I was born, and then there's the 1980s, which is when Duncan was born. Here's the 1990s, which I think is, were you all born? Yeah, 90s. There's the 1990s. There's the 2000s. Right, there's the first few years of this decade. So temperature's going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. So like I said, I make a living doing stand-up comedy, and so I talk to a lot of conservative audiences and business audiences and folks who aren't necessarily convinced that humans are contributing to increases in global temperatures. And what I tell those folks is that if you're not convinced that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation, innovation, development of new technologies, all the things that I at least love about capitalism. Right, so what I work on as an economist, and the reason I went to graduate school to study economics, what I work on as an economist is using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. So whatever you think about capitalism, maybe you like capitalism, maybe you hate capitalism, I think we should all be able to agree that capitalism is a very powerful force, right? The economic system is very powerful. And what I work on as an economist and what Carbon Washington is all about is how do we use that, how do we turn that powerful force to work on protecting the environment, and in particular to addressing climate change. So a couple of policy tools, a couple of economic tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system. But the point of those policy tools is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. Right, now this is generally the part in my talk where people stop laughing, right? Because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and things like this. But there is a side benefit to these policies, other than the main benefit of, potentially saving the world. And the side benefit is that if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue, a bunch of tax revenue. Right? And government can do all sorts of things with that revenue. I'm sure you all have your own ideas of what the government can do with a pile of revenue. But the idea that we work on and talk to folks about, since we're trying to find a bipartisan approach to climate change, is that we can be using most or all of that money to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So it's called environmental tax reform, or tax shifting, or revenue neutral tax swaps. Right? The idea being that if we had higher taxes on things we want less of, like pollution, then we could afford to have lower taxes on things we want more of, like jobs and income and savings and investment. Right? So that's the basic idea, is we should have higher taxes on bad things and then lower taxes on good things. Doesn't that sound like a good idea?
Mm-hmm.
So economists have been talking about this idea for almost 100 years, and we're finally at a point where we can start putting it into action. There's actually a place that's done this. So in the eyes of many economists, the best climate policy in the world is to our north in the Canadian province of British Columbia, where they had a government that said, look, we want to do something about climate change, but we don't want to grow government, we want to be market friendly, so they have a carbon tax, and they use the revenue to reduce existing taxes. So yes, in British Columbia, they pay 30 cents a gallon more for gasoline. That's not nothing. But they also have the lowest personal income taxes in Canada, and low business taxes. There's a specific offset for low-income households. As an economist, I would say that's a very smart policy. So our group, Carbon Washington, is working on a similar policy for Washington State. You can see it described on the back of the handout that Jonathan passed around. Oops, sorry, let me say, while you're looking at that, I can say a couple things about British Columbia. So first of all, the policy went into effect in 2008, so we can actually see how it's been working. So here's carbon emissions in British Columbia in green compared to Canada as a whole is in blue. The drop here in these years was because of what happened in 2008.
Housing crisis.
Housing crisis, financial crisis, global economic meltdown. Right, so that was this drop right here, but you can see that BC has stayed low and Canada as a whole has gone up. So my title for this slide is Economics Works. Kind of like when you make something more expensive, people buy less of it. Yes, sir?
So what happens when nobody buys petroleum and there's no tax revenue from that to go back into the communities?
So when nobody buys petroleum without any tax revenue, then we have a revenue issue,
Yeah.
but we have solved global climate change.
Yeah.
That's not so bad, right? And if we got rid of all of fossil fuels, right, then we would have other tax issues anyway. For example, how do we pay for highways and road maintenance and stuff right now? With gas tax, right? But if we're not using fossil fuels anymore, then we don't have any gas tax. And so we'll have to do something else. So that vision that you're presenting, I think is a very positive vision.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost certainly a vision that's sort of 30 or 40 years away. And the point of this is to push in that direction, right? But in a 30 or 40 year time horizon, we're going to have to, we'll have to deal with the tax reform perspective. That's a really good question. Anyone else has questions as we go along? Feel free to just toss up your hand. So BC has successfully reduced carbon emissions, and here's the economy in BC. Do you all know what GDP is? Gross domestic product. So it's a measure of economic activity, right? So BC and Canada are doing, BC is doing just as well as Canada as a whole. So the bottom line from British Columbia is they implemented this carbon tax, and the province didn't fall into the ocean. And they're doing fine. Yeah. So it's a shining example of a place that successfully implemented a policy like this. So this is the handout the slide that you have on the backs of your handouts. So we're looking at doing something similar in Washington State. We're actually we're going to file a ballot measure next week in Washington State. So one reason why we're chatting with you all is to hopefully get you excited about becoming part of this campaign. So we don't. The policy in Washington State is have a carbon tax that's roughly similar to what they have in British Columbia. So $25 or $30 per ton of CO2. So that's about 25 cents a gallon of gasoline. So that's not nothing. and it'll increase the price of electricity for a lot of folks in the state, although in Seattle we're fortunate enough to have a lot of electricity from hydropower through Seattle City Light. And then what do we do with that money? Most of it is gonna go to cut the state sales tax by a full percentage point.
What does that do?
How many of you pay sales taxes? How many of you buy things? All right, everybody pays sales taxes. So what that does is in very
Food is gonna be cheaper?
groceries are actually exempt from sales tax.
Oh.
But like if you go to a restaurant or you buy coffee, or candy bars are probably subject to sales tax. So some food items are subject to the sales tax. But when you buy like notebooks or computers or books or iPhones,
It'll be cheaper?
yeah, it'll be a little bit cheaper. So the basic idea that we're talking about here is for most households in Washington State, we're saying let's change the tax system so that you pay a few $100s more every year for fossil fuels and a few $100s less every year for everything else. Less for clothes, less for school supplies, and you pay more for gasoline and you know, if you fly around the country, then you pay more for that too. How many of you think that sounds like a reasonable idea? So you're in line with most economists think that's a pretty reasonable idea too. So cut the sales tax by a full point. We're going to fund something called the Working Families Rebate, which is it's a state level version of a federal program. It's the largest anti-poverty program in the United States, called Earned Income Tax Credit. So the Earned Income Tax Credit, if you're low income and you're working, then you get a check back from the government every year that tops up your income. And about half of the states have a state level bump up of the federal Earned Income Tax Credit. And this would fund up to $1,500 a year for 400,000 working families in Washington State. So we're concerned about the impacts of our policy on low income households. And they're going to get some benefit from the sales tax reduction because everybody pays the sales tax, and it's especially hard on low income households. But low income households will also get a benefit from this Working Families Rebate. And then we're concerned about impacts on manufacturers. So the steel mill that's in Seattle, or maybe Boeing, or pulp mills, or there's actually a bunch of facilities in Eastern Washington that I learned about recently that they're food processing facilities. So basically what they do is they take in French fries and they chop them up and freeze them and put them into a bag and then ship them to McDonald's all over the country. Right, so that uses a lot of natural gas to do that. So to address impacts on manufacturers, we're going to effectively eliminate the existing business tax for manufacturers in the state. So the existing business tax, it taxes businesses based on how much revenue they generate. And instead, we think it makes a lot more sense to tax businesses based on how much carbon they emit. How much pollution are you generating? Because then you have this nice way to line up private incentives with social incentives. Right, so the social incentive is we want them to burn less fossil fuels. We want them to produce less carbon dioxide. We want them to help save the planet. Right? And the private incentive is businesses want to make money. They want to make money. Right? So we're trying to line up the private incentives with the social incentives by saying, look, you want to make money? The way to make money is to reduce your carbon emissions, because then you'll pay less in the carbon tax. Let's see. Oh, we have a nice endorsement from Seattle Business Magazine. So you can check out this article on our website. That they said a carbon tax works and Washington should implement one. And then I want to mention this thing. So if any of you have phones or laptops or anything like that and want to play around with looking at how this would affect your own household, we've worked with some folks at the University of Washington on a carbon tax swap calculator. How cool is that? So you can go to the calculator tool and it actually asks you to estimate your household income, and then it estimates what your sales tax savings will be. And then you say how much do you drive, how much does your household drive, and how much do you fly, and it estimates what your carbon tax liabilities would be. And then at the end you get a number. The number tells you, hey, you're gonna, your household would be $100 better off or $100 worse off or whatever it happens to be. So I encourage you to check that out.
Is that on there?
I'm sorry? The calculator?
Yeah.
The website for the calculator, you mean? Oh, you can also access it from our website, from carbonwa.org. So, what we have to share with you today. Let's see if Duncan has anything that he wants to add, and then we want to make sure to take your questions and have a good discussion with this.
That covers it for the most part. So keep the pamphlets. The small piece of paper I gave you, so Yaron covered the policy side of things really well. What we left off at the end though is how we do it. And so what we need to do is gather signatures from the voting public in Washington State, and we need to get 315,000 signatures in order to have our policy put on the ballot so that the public can vote on it and decide if they want to implement our policy statewide. And so starting next month and running all through the year until the end of December, we're going to be gathering signatures. So if this kind of speaks with you guys and you want to do something to do a little civic engagement over the summer, you want to go out to grocery stores or chat with your friends and family and help collect signatures in support of our policy, then the small card I gave you, put your name and email address on there, and we can get a hold of you over the summer once you guys aren't in school any longer. Yeah?
Just as a clarification, would this be for students who are 18 and over and eligible for voting?
So we're not specifically looking for the students to sign on. If you are 18 and are able to vote at that point in time, then great, we'd love to have your signature. But this is really just to help young people get involved in their community and take the petition forms and go to places and get other folks to sign on in support of the policy so that we can actually have it on the ballot.
And you can do that even if you're not 18 yet.
You can, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
if you're not 18, you can't vote, but you can still go out and collect signatures. So, let's see. Oh, I want to share with you one other thing, which is I'm spending a considerable portion of my life working on this issue, on climate change and using economic instruments to address climate change. And folks like Duncan and others who are involved in the campaign are also putting a lot of time and effort into this. And I want to give you a sense of I want to give you a sense of why I think this is so important, and this actually comes down to I have my very own theory of the world that I'm kind of proud of, so I want to share it with you. It's called the 5 Chinas theory of the world, and the theory of the world, 5 Chinas theory of the world says you can take the world population, which is how many people about? 7 billion people. And you divide by 5, you get 1.4 billion, which is approximately the population of China, right? So you actually divide the world up into these 5 population groups that are the size of China. Right, so China is one. The second one, another country, India is about as many people as China. Right? Out of everybody else in developing Asia, that's the 3rd China. So Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Philippines, Vietnam, put them all together, about the same population as China. And so one of the lessons of the 5 Chinas theory of the world is that there are a lot of people in Asia. Right? 3 of the 5 Chinas are in Asia. The 4th China is the rich world. So not just the United States, but also Canada, Europe, Japan, South Korea, a couple other random countries, put them all together, about the same population as China. And then the 5th China is principally everybody else, which is, 5th China is everybody else, which is principally Africa and South America. All right, so you take these 5 Chinas, and if you think about world carbon emissions, like from fossil fuels, at the beginning of this century in 2000, the rich world, which is one of those 5 Chinas, right, the rich world was responsible for about half of world CO2 emissions. And I think as an economist that there are going to be 2 big stories of this century. I think one of those stories is a generally quite happy story. It's going to be about growth and development. I imagine you've learned a bit about the growth in China over the last 30 years as their economy is growing very fast. And in many ways that's positive, right, as people get access to electricity, transportation, healthcare, education, things that we take for granted. And hopefully we're going to see similar waves of development in India and in Africa over the course of this century. And I think that's one of the big stories of this century. I think the other big story of this century is going to be dealing with the environmental impacts of having 7 billion people on this planet, growing to, by the time you all are 60 or whatever, like probably 10 or 11 billion people on the planet, right? Who are all trying to live the lifestyles that we live. So that's my 5 Chinas theory. That's why. Yes.
Have you heard of or read Windfall, the booming business of climate change?
So let's see, so who'd be benefiting and who'd be losing from climate change? I mean, I think a lot of it is that we don't exactly know what the planet is gonna look like in 50 years or 100 years, right? Because essentially we're going back to conditions that, you know, CO2 levels that we're at now have not existed for hundreds of thousands of years, possibly for millions of years. So it's not clear what changes are going to be manifested in terms of weather patterns or rising sea levels and things like that. I think
economically.
Yeah, economically, I mean, you could make some arguments that maybe, you know, Canada will be better able to grow crops. Maybe Siberia, you'll be able to grow crops. You know, there are some potential economic benefits in terms of once we melt all the ice around the Arctic, then ships can start traveling there, right? Save time coming from Asia to Europe. But I think there are a number of risks to consider in terms of rising sea levels and changing weather patterns. Certainly, how many of you are from the Seattle area? Okay, a bunch of folks from the Seattle area. So you may have noticed that we didn't really have a winter this year.
Yeah.
And you know, if you have friends who are in Boston, they've had kind of a double winter. So remember that there's a difference between climate and weather. But certainly in the Seattle area, in Washington State, one of the big impacts of climate change is going to be on snowpack. So we had very, very low snow this year, and with warmer temperatures, we're going to move towards that kind of condition more often because we'll have more precipitation falling as rain instead of snow, and then the snow that's there is going to melt off faster. And that's important because the snow, like in the Cascades, serves as sort of a natural reservoir. So typically it'll snow a lot in the winter months, and then it'll hang out in the mountains, and then it just happens to melt like in June and July and August, which is when it's dry here, so we need water, farmers need water. So impacts on snowpack are important consideration. Who else has questions?
So we have a excuse me. We have a weekly email list written by our wonderful Yaram. So there is typically a little bit of good humor in there as well. So you don't get a whole lot of information, but you get weekly updates on the campaign and how things are progressing. And we're doing a lot of things right now. So we're going to be moving into a new office space soon, hiring some staff, and it's really kind of a cool place to learn more about carbon pricing and particularly what our campaign is doing. So you would get those emails, but what I'm going to do is, what I'm collecting from you folks here is, I'm going to identify that you're students, and then we'd like to reach out to you specifically in the summertime and say, hey, we'd love to have you come out to an event. We're going to have a number of organizers throughout the state, and we're trying to have a lot of fun. You know, organizing can be pretty droll, and it's not necessarily within everybody's comfort zone to go out and talk to people about various topics. But our organizers are great. They're really friendly folks and want to make sure that everybody's out having a fun time and learning about policy and process and how things get done while not being turned off by it. So we'd really love to have you get out, come out, hang out, to go collect a few signatures and then maybe have a little hangout session in the park or go home or whatever you want to do. But that's kind of our plan in that organizing, and then we get to do that with young folks and adults alike multiple times a week all summer long. So if you guys are interested, we'd love to have you on board.
There's an added bonus for if you end up volunteering on the campaign, you'll almost certainly end up getting a gift from me that will be a copy of my cartoon book about climate change. So I think I have a copy that I'll circulate just so you all can take a look at it. Let's start with John.
I have that book.
You have that book. That's my book. I wrote that book.
I haven't read it.
You haven't read it. Well, let's see. Other questions? Do you want to run through we can pull up the tax stop calculator if you want to see how that works.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. Let's see. Assuming we can get an internet connection here. Microsoft calculator. Okay, so let's just make up some numbers. So who wants to give me, just make up a number for some annual household income? I'm sorry? $2,000?
For a year?
That's a little low. Annual, yeah. I'm sorry? 32,000. Okay. Okay, so the estimate is that you currently pay that if your household makes $32,000 a year, we're estimating that you pay about $1,338 a year in sales taxes. Because nickels and dimes add up over the course of the year. Okay, so if we had a 1 percentage point reduction in the sales tax, then you're going to save about 150 bucks. So that's the plus side of the policy. And then we have to look at the potential negatives of the policy. All right, so the working families rebate. Let's see. We can play around with this and say, let's say you have one kid, maybe you're married, filing jointly. So it's possible that this household is going to qualify for the earned income tax credit at the federal level, and they'd get an earned income tax credit of about $2,000, so they'd get an extra $500 from the state. And maybe the household actually wouldn't qualify for the working families rebate. It sort of depends on the particular household. So let's see, gasoline. How many gallons of gasoline does this household use every week? 50? 30 gallons.
5 cars.
If 5 cars. $32,000 of income and 5 cars. 12 gallons? Okay, that seems like a more reasonable number. So use 12 gallons a week. So 12 gallons a week.
Attention staff and students, teachers, please remember to escort your students to the auditorium for the all-school assembly.
That's not us, though.
No, that's not us.
That's not you. All right. So if you're using 12 gallons of gas in a week, then you're paying about $139 a year because the gas price is going to go up. Okay. So let's talk about air travel. Let's see. How much does this household fly every year from Seattle? 3. 3 what?
Inches.
3 trips?
Inches.
3 miles? So let's say you fly 5,000 miles from Seattle every year. So that's 2 people going to New York each year. So that's 20 bucks. So very roughly, flying from Seattle to New York or anywhere else uses about the same amount of fuel per person as driving like a Toyota Prius, that same distance per person on the airplane. So it turns out that you know the price of a plane ticket to New York would go up by about $10. Doesn't seem like all that much, right? Okay. All right, and then the complicated one is the home energy use. So let's see, let's say you live in a single family home or apartment. What zip code should we use? 98106. All right, 98106 tells us that, hey, you get served by Seattle City Light. This was actually the hardest part of the calculator because it turns out that there are 60 electric utilities in Washington State, and there's no easy way to figure out from what zip code somebody lives in to figure out what their electric utility is. So this was the hardest part of the calculator. How does this person heat their home? Natural gas? Electricity? Wood pellets. Wood pellets turn out to be the easy one. Let's say it's natural gas. Okay. And let's say that they use about 100% of an average household in Washington State. So let's say this is an average household. All right, so an average household is going to, in Seattle City Light territory, the electricity is so clean that you only pay an extra $2 a year on the carbon tax. But you have to pay about $100 a year from the natural gas that you use to heat your home. So then we can go to the summary of results. So we estimate that you're going to save $626, of which about $500 was the working families rebate, and the rest was reductions in sales taxes, and you're going to pay about $258 a year in carbon taxes. So overall, we estimate you're going to save $350 a year. So that's just to give you a sense of how the calculator works. Is that neat?
Pretty neat.
Anything else you want to add, Duncan?
No, I think we've covered pretty much it.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else has any questions though?
We have a couple minutes. Questions about carbon taxes, questions about climate change, questions about stand-up comedy, questions about economics, questions about the University of Washington. Yes.
How long have you been a stand-up comedian?
How long have I been a stand-up comedian? It started out about 10 years ago as a hobby, and then it became my day job. I would say like in the last, basically the story of the last 8 years or so was that it started out as being 0% of my income, and then 10% of my income, and then 20% of my income, and now it's 100% of my income. That plus these cartoon books. So mostly, I occasionally I do shows at comedy clubs, but mostly I do colleges and corporate events, which turns out to be a little bit more lucrative than comedy clubs. It's a cool occupation. I recommend it. Although I have a 6-month-old baby at home now, and the travel is a little bit more difficult when you have a baby. Who else has questions? Comments? Yeah.
Can you tell us some jokes?
Can I tell you some jokes? Let's see. I told you all some jokes before. I'll tell you. I have a couple jokes that are not about economics. I have a joke about Spanish.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
That doesn't happen at comedy clubs. I have a joke about Spanish, which I speak reasonably well, but not perfectly. As I learned a few years ago, this was well before I was married, and I was down in Ecuador practicing my Spanish in a bar with a beautiful young woman. Because economists are people too. And finally she turned to me and she said in Spanish, she said, "Hey, if you're so great, how come you're not married?" And I wanted to say something sort of flirtatiously self-deprecating. You know, like, I don't know, maybe women don't like me. Right? And what I ended up saying was, "Tal vez no me gustan las mujeres," which means maybe I don't like women. When I found out what I said, I felt very embarazada, which means pregnant. I also have a joke about, I don't know how this is going to work with this crowd. I have a joke about quinoa. Does anybody here actually know what quinoa is?
Yeah, I had it this
Everybody
morning.
knows what quinoa is?
Yeah.
What is quinoa?
The little rice thing.
It's like an ancient grain.
Like, my mom makes it every morning for breakfast.
Okay. Yeah, so quinoa is like an ancient grain.
Said I had some.
It turns out that it's actually a meta joke about quinoa, and the meta joke is that it's very difficult to tell jokes about quinoa because 90% of the American public has no idea what quinoa is. And of the people who do know what it is, half of them think it's pronounced quinoa. And so the only place I've ever been able to successfully tell jokes about quinoa is like at the PCC or the food co-op. Right? Because at the food co-op, not only does everybody know the substance named quinoa, at the food co-op, everybody knows a person named quinoa.